Good morning and welcome to College of Idaho Insights. We're here today with Steve Mon from our Department of History and Professors Carrie Hunter and Jasper Lacalzi from the Department of Political Economy. Today we'll be talking about a New York Times article about China's versus America's political systems. And Carrie, why don't you tell us a little bit of your thoughts on this recent article in the Times?
Yeah, it was a fun article for me to read. Notably, the guy who wrote it is a venture capitalist, so he's got some concerns, and primarily he seems to be lamenting the American inability to govern itself, which is something I find myself lamenting a lot recently. But he's somewhat confused. At times, he talks about America as a democratic society. In fact, that's kind of his big thing. We're a democratic, open society. And yet, he says, actually, America's one person, one vote democracy didn't really start until 47 years ago after the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And he notes that the founding fathers actually didn't believe in democracy as in terms of a majoritarian democracy, but they really were more interested in republicanism. Ultimately, though, he suggests that this conflict between U.S. and China is about a society committed to democracy versus an authoritarian regime which, due to its authoritarianness, is able to do what it needs to do. And you know, in my mind, he doesn't quite understand, and he sort of does, because he recognizes we're not totally committed to democracy, at least our founding fathers weren't. And I like to suggest that we really are more constitutionalist in a sense. We believe in rights, which he suggests are the case, but our commitment to inalienable rights isn't so neatly folded into our commitment to majoritarian democracy as he wants to suggest. There's really quite a conflict there. And in my mind, it's that conflict. We're still sorting out that conflict. We're still sort of fighting about that conflict. So it makes it much more complex than what Mr. Lee is envisioning.
Well, I think it's interesting that he emphasizes that American style and Western style democracies are a product of the European Enlightenment, and suggests that the Chinese approach is a much more ancient and stable approach. But interestingly enough, he's taking the same assumption of the 18th century Enlightenment, and that is that you can apply universalist principles to governance and to thinking through how different cultures and societies should approach the fundamental question that every government faces. As you both know, how do you create legitimacy? How do you establish levels of support sufficient for the government to function without internal rebellion? And his suggestion that somehow there is a universal modern template upon which to judge both China and America, and the American system is wanting, is fundamentally out of step with the recognition that all political cultures are in fact themselves evolutionary and independent and largely autonomous. And they make their own adjustments to their own internal and external challenges.
And you look at, you were saying, lumping the United States in with other European democratic systems, it's a lot less democratic. Especially you look at how unique our system is with a independent, powerful president, executive, which no other democratic system has, that it's completely separated from the legislature. The legislature doesn't have complete powers, that we elect this legislature in single-member districts, which is done in very few places. It's depending upon how you want to measure or evaluate democracy, our system isn't very democratic. If he wants to go against, if he wants to say, well, China is better than a democratic, he could have made a much better choice than the United States if he wants to do a democratic system.
As you know, it's ironic that when American foreign policymakers go out into the world to create democracy, they don't create American-style democracy. They create Westminster-style parliamentary systems because they are, in fact, more democratic.
Well, in another way, we're not as democratic, which he kind of set me up for. he looks at the California referendum system and suggesting that America is going to become more like California, even more direct democracy, more referendum. But just a week or so ago, the Ninth Circuit ruled that the California referendum against gay marriage was unconstitutional in terms of the state's constitution. Suggesting again another very undemocratic element of the American system, and that is
the Supreme Court, which of course what you study,
Right.
is very undemocratic. And what other country allows a Supreme Court to rule that laws passed by its national legislature can be thrown out by an unelected court? How undemocratic is that?
Well, and one of the striking statements that Lee makes is, well, we're moving towards democracy because we started out with a limited property-owning democracy, and then we moved to gender equity, and then after the Civil Rights Act, we moved to ethnic and racial equality, and now we're becoming even more democratic with Citizens United, where it's $1, one vote. Well, I mean, of course, this argument is completely the reverse of what Citizens United represents. It represents a return to powerful, not landed, but capitalist now interests, as the economy has changed in 250 years, who have an undue influence on guiding the direction of the republic.
No,
and so, I mean, in some senses, we're not moving to a more democratic system in any striking fashion.
Which is again a point he's clearly missed. He says $1 one vote, which means $1 million, a million votes. And which means
I don't have $1 million.
Well, you don't, but some do, and those are the ones who are really calling the shots. So to me, the big question really comes down to not so much as can American democracy be flexible enough to solve our problems, but can the elite rule of the million vote, can that kind of approach to politics get the same kind of results that the founding fathers, if you like that term, believed men of virtue could accomplish? Isolate people of virtue from the masses, and you can get good government. Was
Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, that's the vision of the founders. The question I have now is, can you isolate big money from the masses and get good government? I'm not sure we've seen the answer to that, and it's not quite that simple, but I think that's part of the conflict.
But I think that ties more with what you study too. I mean, with the landed aristocracy, that you have enough money, you're beyond these petty interests.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, if you have someone who's a plumber and they're worried, they're going to care about that. But if you were so wealthy, you're above that. You can look out for the national interest, which is, I think, some of the ideas that.
But are they?
Past the
But
European,
is this group capable of looking after the national interest? Certainly, with the bank fiasco, it doesn't seem to be the case. But that's
they weren't rich.
Well, and again,
so you have to be so
Well,
rich.
they're pretty darn
that you
rich.
can-
But I think the
that
problem
you're
is they're
beyond
not totally as disconnected as perhaps someone like Plato would hope they might be, because there still is this demagoguery link. There still is the ideal of democracy in America, and so in some ways we might have the worst of all worlds. You have a lot of people wanting that representatives have to somehow keep happy, and yet you have these wealthy people calling the shots at another level, and it's not really clear to me that anyone really is.
On the other hand, we may have the best of all worlds as well. I was, on reading this article, reminded of the debates of the 1980s about the efficiency of totalitarianism, about, there's a very famous book that came out in the middle of Reagan's first term, How Democracies Perish, by a French right-winger, Jean-Francois Revel. And he essentially said, democracies, they need to steal, gird their loins, they need to fight. The totalitarian countries are efficient, they're focused, they play dirty pool, they do whatever they can to take over the world, and we're losing. Well, that was 1983 when he wrote this book.
By 91.
And he was lamenting that Yuri Andropov was just another Stalinist. And things can change so rapidly. I think one of the things that Revel at that time failed to take into account, and that Lee fails to take into account as well, is the kind of dynamism that open societies, in fact, in very unexpected ways unleash, even if there is the power of money, even if there is the power of elites and of corporate interests. The fact that the society is open, we now see a transformative set of processes attached to the internet, information exchange, new forms of
you see a
political
lot of dynamism
association.
now in not so open societies.
Right.
Whether it's Syria or Egypt, that with
Right.
the internet, and you could even go, or
Right. How do you
Russian Revolution.
put down these new movements? You surround
even old
cities and you
movements.
shell them into submission.
The same way the Tsar tried to. I mean, you know, you have. I mean, there's been revolutions always. That's why I would say, oh, look what Facebook has caused these revolutions. There's never been any revolutions in the history of the world before this. No,
And this gets back to the whole question. I mean, Noam Chomsky came out with that book, in the 80s, called Manufacturing Consent, in which he argued that the democratic traditions of the United States of America are essentially in the pocket of corporate interests. That news media controlled by corporations has brainwashed the American public. Well, it's very difficult to buy that argument when you see things like Arab Springs, where you have autonomous sets of ideas through very difficult to control lines of political development of political ideology and political talk, and ultimately. Yes, there is a lot of money interests. Yes, there are corporate interests. Yes, most Americans do think in certain patterns that are set by the media, but that doesn't mean that they control or brainwash, as you say. It's a much more difficult process to achieve.
Right, but to get back partly, I think, to what this article, this fellow's arguing, he's frustrated with the American inability, in his mind, to respond to some of the pressing issues of the day. And
it seems like he wants a massive investment in a high-speed rail system, much like China has accomplished over the last decade.
Or something. I mean, and I think there's some element of truth to his frustration. How do you explain the banking crisis, for example? How is it that the bankers are giving loans to so many people who can't really afford to buy these houses? I mean, there is pressure from below, a kind of democratic pressure to make everyone equal, as Alexis de Tocqueville saw it. But there's also this control from the elites above. And again, to me, the two aren't necessarily meshing. Good policy is not necessarily coming out from that conflict. And to me, that's the frustration that he's feeling in a sense, and again, a very simplified way of putting it. But yeah, who's running the ship? It's not clear that anyone is.
Well, and again, he suggests that, China had its challenges, and in particular, it had essentially a democracy movement driven by students. And of course, on July 4th, 1989, June 4th, 1989, the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square, and look at what's happened in China since. It's been fantastic. It's almost like he's advocating for the tanks to roll, sort of into New York City and put down the Occupy movement. It's a strange. I mean, when you start thinking about the parallels and the implications of that, it's a strange.
I think he might be having some of the same issues you were talking about that others did in the 80s, looking at how wonderful China looks right now, where I think they could be on very shaky ground in a number of different areas. You look at especially, I just saw what Apple is pushing for better working conditions, which means a lot more money. That's a whole lot more money. People are making now $6 a day, or
better than $2 a day.
Yeah, but once you start getting this more of a middle class who has money, then they're going to start saying, I can make all these decisions, my own personal decisions, in the economic realm. When can I start making them in the political realm? And I think in the past, you go back to the 70s, especially when I think of, that's what happened in Korea, in Taiwan, which were authoritarian governments. The country starts becoming wealthy.
Money destabilizes authority.
Exactly, and then people will start wanting to see more. And
they want to actually see more. They want to be able to see through the cloud of pollution.
Well, they want to be able to say, "Hey, how come I can't? Why can't I help be involved in these decisions?" And I think it's too early to be applauding China in its current system.
But again, I mean, you could also, I suppose, in another crude historical way, suggest that in the time, I mean, this guy suggests in the time of American industrial development, early industrial, we were democratic, and he points out we really weren't. And so, again, oftentimes states have in their earlier years had much more authoritarian measures when it comes to developing industry. The U.S. certainly had plenty of government involvement in
Seized an entire continent and then gave it out to
Right.
those people willing to
building railroads,
the lands
dams,
up.
whatever.
That's what Caldwell.
That's where Caldwell
History
came
of
from.
Caldwell, it's the
Exactly.
railroad.
So you could see China is in this stage, and again, eventually, you get enough wealth, and they'll be forced to open up more democratically.
And I think part of the push, and that's where you get the real expansion of democracy in the United States, is in the 1820s and 1830s. And it's Andrew Jackson. No, it was a lot of people starting to make money, and wealth starting to spread out a great deal more, and people demanding much more democracy.
And what was the great solvent that broke down the centuries, the millennia-old Chinese imperial system? It was vast amounts of silver flowing into Eastern economies after the discovery, right, by Columbus, right, of the New World. And we all know that those are contested terms, but the simple fact is, with the Spanish arrival in the New World, the immense flows of gold and silver bullion into the Old World, that the old imperial systems of the pre-modern world were incapable of containing. Cities, merchant groups, the solvent of money broke those systems down, precisely the systems that Lee seems to suggest are superior in dealing with the challenges of a rapidly changing both economic and social landscape. And so again, it's, there are a lot of open questions. The other thing is, who knows? 20, 30 years, I think you both are in a political economy department. You don't call yourself political scientists, not least because it's becoming less and less credible that the social sciences are capable of projecting in any kind of viable way, very far into the future, the predictive qualities of science. And so anything can happen. But
I think they have
according to certain
predictive
patterns.
qualities that they don't have to be as empirically based as some would.
Or is rooted in the rational actor model.
Right.
But I think, to step back a little bit, really what he's looking at here, we've touched on this before, is your two broad approaches. A traditional classic conservative approach versus a classic liberal. That it's outcome versus process. How do you get what's best? Is it a democratic system where you say, if we have a fair democratic system, it will produce the best results? Or more of a classic conservative, the process doesn't matter, let's just evaluate what the results are. And that's what I think he's seeing is kind of
and you can
the
take this back
dichotomy
once
here.
again, as he does to begin with, through the European Enlightenment. You can, sort of Voltaire said, enlightened despots. You need to have centralized government, rational, well-educated leaders who make the right decisions to improve the lives and conditions of their subjects. Then you get Rousseau, who says no. A government that is not fundamentally interactive and democratic is fundamentally immoral. And those two models have been, at least in classical European political philosophy, struggling with each other and struggling to produce different mixed systems of governance ever since.
But I think you go away. Rousseau's looking at it from a moral perspective, but others have looked at the democratic process as the best means to get the best results. That by bringing in the ideas of so many, that no one has a monopoly on what is the good.
Groupthink.
That all people contributing is how you get to the best result.
Well, and remember Tocqueville's concern about what kind of demagoguery or what kind of tyranny did democracies have to fear, which I think might be another way to look at this. You do have arguably an American public that is more concerned about the economy, more concerned about their interests than they are about moral politics. I mean, you do have your right wing in the Conservative Party that has this strong God and country kind of movement. But as Bill Clinton told himself often, it's all about the economy, stupid, or I guess it's the economy, stupid, or something like that. And
Is the economy stupid?
as long as the American public is that manipulable by the economy, by interest groups. Again, this guy has a point. There's a certain kind of demagoguery out there. And if Americans, as long as we are getting enough bread and circuses, we're willing to tolerate a fair amount. And I think Tocqueville's concerned that in the end, even a democratic system could become somewhat authoritarian as the people become passive and just concerned about their stuff. Makes a certain amount of sense. I don't know quite where Eric Lee, how he would respond to that particular issue.
But he's not here, so we can just beat up on him.
But it seems to me that's another part of the dynamic that we're very, I mean, Americans are committed to rights to pursue wealth. And we're not a democracy in that we want to bring everybody down.
Level upwards.
Right now, Obama has a difficult time trying to convince the masses that we ought to tax the wealthy. I mean, that
Which
seems
is
kind of bizarre.
extraordinary.
But again, to me, it's because we're so committed to
Rights.
these rights, the ideals of rights.
That's
But
all
it's
from
rights
Locke.
for stuff.
But also aspirational capitalist
Someday I can
democracy.
win. I can win the lottery too. When I do,
if
I
I
don't
were
want
Bill
tax.
Gates, I wouldn't want to be taxed either.
But he does.
That's the irony.
But I
isn't it?
wouldn't if I
That's
was
right.
him.
Warren Buffett says, "No, tax me more. My secretary is taxed
And
too
Governor
much." But
Christie says, "Well,
but-
shut up and pay. Just donate some money."
Right, exactly.
Well, what I find, you're saying that, the elites take over regardless, and that's from, elitist thinking from Mosca, Pareto, all said. It doesn't matter what kind of system you set up.
Right.
The elites are going to take, the elites run the place anyway. And they were somewhat.
Plato knew that.
Well,
It's just a question of which elites.
Which elites? Well, and that's what Mosca discusses too. And as long as you have, it's a changing elite. The ability to that it's not.
It's an open elite.
Right.
It's an open elite and can change. Then that's why he was.
and to
saw
me-
somewhat favorably to Mussolini.
There's
and the
this,
fascists.
again, there's the
don't bring up
strength of
Mussolini
there's
over
the
there.
strength of American democracy, if you want to call it that, when the Supreme Court rules that in 2000 George Bush is going to be our president, and the American public go back to work. I mean, there were certain pundits say, "Oh, this is a constitutional crisis." Well, it wasn't at all.
There would have been a constitutional crisis if a fleet of Ford F-150s with AK-47 or M16 wielding militiamen had sort of rolled on Washington D.C. That would have been a crisis.
But if we believed in
It's so funny,
democracy,
right.
if
Then
we really believed in democracy,
it
that's
would
what
have been
should
a
happen.
crisis.
But
But
no,
we
we
don't-
believe in constitutionalism.
Exactly. The rule of law, and I don't.
Regardless of how you define the law.
Well, to me, the rule of law, as in natural law, inalienable rights handed down from God law, the right to get rich law. That's what governs this society. It's not a commitment to democracy in any sort of majoritarian sort of way.
Fine, that's what the Declaration of Independence basically says. I mean, you could say happiness. You could change the word happiness, like Jefferson did, but it's still about property, and it's still from Locke, and that's what that's what our society's principally built upon,
Which is
on the
sort
rights
of
based.
Which is sort of interesting because Locke starts with rights based, but then wants to entrust the majority. But by the time the founders were writing, the majorities were no longer trusted.
Well, they weren't trusted by those founders.
by those founders, precisely.
They didn't trust a different set of elites.
And today, the Supreme Court remains the most revered political institution in the country.
No, it's actually-
The least democratic.
In New York Times just had an article about that, how it's actually gone down, and they think it's partially because issues with conflicts of interest that they haven't dealt with, and with openness, that the oral arguments aren't televised. So they're looking at they might try to open them up, kind of democratize them to some
I would
extent.
argue that would have
It's
a reversed result. In fact, in recent years,
People would see the making of the sausage.
right, it's much easier to listen to oral arguments online and that sort of thing. But if you televise them, I'm guessing the respect for the court will even diminish. It's that secrecy that preserved its reverence in the past that I think will, the more we democratize it, the less we will be.
And there's two institutions we have which really fit into that. It's the Supreme Court, and the other is the Federal Reserve. Both that are secret and both somewhat almost quasi-religious. You could argue with, and what we've done with
Priests in the temple.
yes, exactly. The
Cult of the robe.
What you see with the Fed too is how it's been more democratized as far as its rulings have come out to be much more in real time. We know how they're deciding. They have to come out and tell us this is what the goals of the Fed are for the future. So they're becoming more transparent too, which is potentially. So we're opening up the doors of the temple a little bit, and I don't think you want to see what the priests are doing back there.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for participating in today's discussion, and thank you to all of our viewers. Have a good day.